deep breath for a moment, and if you didn't fill out your card yet, and some of you did and brought it forward, but you can still think about who taught you the meaning of generosity. After the first service, one of our older members came out literally in tears and said to me, my mother, he said, I wrote down my parents on my card. He said, but particularly my mother, she was always give, 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 give. And he had tears in his eyes. So, who did you write down? Did you think about whether or not anybody wrote you down as an example of generosity? The people that I wrote down, I'm going to talk about at the end of my sermon, or toward the end of my sermon. But I'll start by saying that as I contemplated that question, I realized that I have been taught about generosity by people who were generous, and also by people who were not so generous. During my 24 years of ministry, I've known people who earned, let's just say $100,000 a year and gave 1% of it away, and then struggled about letting go of that $1,000. And I've known people who earned $10,000 a year and gave 10% of it away, and wished with all their hearts that they could give more than that $1,000. I've known people who are extremely wealthy, who are extremely generous. I've known people who struggle financially and are extremely generous. And I've known the opposite to be true as well. And so as I've thought about this, it's occurred to me that people give for a variety of reasons. People give sometimes out of habit, sometimes out of a sense of obligation. Sometimes people give because they want to control things. Sometimes people give out of gratitude. There are those people who give because they support that to which they're giving and it has some way benefited them, or they feel like it benefits the world. Sometimes I think people give because they're afraid. I wondered about that this week. I don't know, probably no one else thought of it in that way but me, but there was an article on the front page of the Beacon Journal this week that detailed what we've always, at least for a number of years, known to be true, which is that the number of people who say that they have a religious affiliation in the United States is declining. And it's declined more in the last 5 years. 5 years ago, 15% of the people in the United States said they had no religious affiliation whatsoever. Now, 5 years later, it's 20%. And this is the part that kind of scares me. That does not include a large group of people who say that they never attend worship or have any connection with a religious organization, and yet they claim a religious affiliation. You know, 1/3 of the people in the United States under the age of 30, adults, so between 18 and 30, have no religious affiliation whatsoever. And it's not thought, as was true in previous generations, that that's going to change much. Why? Well, because they didn't have any religious affiliation to begin with. So, those kind of numbers might sort of make us uncomfortable and cause us to think, well, boy, I really need to give in the face of that kind of challenge. So we give for a lot of reasons. All the reasons I listed, and probably some that I didn't list. The one reason I'm fairly sure, though, that people are not giving is in order to have my voice on your answering machine. And you remember that Gabe Hyder last week gave that as an incentive for giving. My voice on your answering machine. Another one I can tell you is, as I was listening to NPR this week, they were doing their fund drive, and they were giving away 2 Cleveland Brown tickets. And it was so funny because nobody was in the drawing. And they kept saying, "You're sure to win these tickets. Call in and make your pledge." And nobody called because nobody wanted the Cleveland Brown tickets. And so that's probably another way that another reason that is not a reason for giving. But there's lots of reasons. I think probably the best one, our best giving occurs when our giving is grounded in gratitude for the grace of God. I'm going to say that again, but let me first tie it to the reading from 2 Corinthians, because it's so obvious in that reading that that's what's happening. I don't know if you noticed when it was read today, but in one sentence there are 4 phrases used that somehow don't fit together. The Apostle Paul writes, he's talking about the church in Macedonia, and he says, during a severe, it's very strong language, during a severe ordeal of affliction, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. Now, how can you take the words severe ordeal of affliction, extreme poverty, and end up with abundant joy and a wealth of generosity? It just doesn't make sense. So let's do a little background here. What's happening? Paul is writing to the church in Corinth. The church in Corinth has been having some problems with divisions, and so Paul's written them a couple letters, and in this one he's reminding them that about a year ago, at the time, of course, that this was written, they had promised that they would contribute to a collection for the Christians in Jerusalem. And they haven't done it yet. And so he's telling them, you need to fulfill your commitment. You need to follow through and do what you said you were going to do. And so he points out the Macedonians as an example. And he says to them, look, in spite of the fact that they faced an extreme ordeal, in spite of their poverty, they gave to this collection. Now here's a couple things that make this even more astounding. The word that is used, or the phrase that is used for extreme poverty, means extreme poverty. It means someone who is down to their last cent. It's often used in Scripture in reference to a beggar. It's not poverty like we measure poverty in the United States, which isn't really poverty compared to the rest of the world. We're talking about people who have nothing. Extreme poverty. And the other thing that makes this pretty amazing is that it's their faith that probably has put them in this situation. Because they are excluded from the trade guilds, which would have been their way of making a living, because they refuse to have anything to do with idols. So their extreme poverty and their ordeal has to do with them being followers of Jesus. And yet, how do you explain the fact that in the midst of this challenging circumstance, they have responded to support the Christians in Jerusalem? Well, here's the answer to the puzzle. If you take extreme poverty and you add it to overwhelming ordeal, and then you add to it grace, or maybe I should say awareness of grace, what you end up with is overwhelming joy and overflowing generosity. That's exactly what happened to the Macedonians. As we continue to read, we see that they were so aware and grateful for God's grace in their lives that in spite of this extreme ordeal and overwhelming poverty, they acted to give to others. And not only did they give, they begged for the opportunity to give. Can you imagine? In verse 9, we didn't read verse 9, but it says, this is what they understood, that Jesus, who was rich, became poor so that we might become rich. What does that mean? Well, think about it. Jesus was rich in terms of being the Lord of Lords, in terms of being the one who the Nicene Creed describes as the one who was one being with the Father. Through him all things were made. Jesus was rich. He became poor when he was incarnate as a human being. And of course, his most extreme act of poverty was his death on the cross, through which we became rich. Rich in forgiveness, rich in hope, rich in spiritual gifts, rich in grace. That's the first way that the Macedonians experienced God's grace. The second way is that they were filled with it. They were empowered by it. And that's why, in the midst of these horrible, horrible, awful, terrible circumstances, they not only gave, but they begged for the opportunity to give. They responded with overflowing generosity. So I'll say again, our giving is at its best. There's lots and lots of reasons to give, and all of them are valid, but our giving is at its best when it is grounded in our gratitude for the grace of God in our lives, both as it comes to us through Jesus and as we are empowered by it. So, let me tell you about who I wrote on my card. The names of the people on my card are the pastor and his wife of the church that I attended immediately after I got out of college. Now, I've told parts of this story before, and I can't remember which parts I told and which parts I didn't, so if I don't remember, you may not either, right? That's my theory, and I'm sticking to it. First thing I have to say is that I did not attend a Lutheran church right out of college, and I might not have learned this lesson had I, I'm sad to say, which is part of the reason this is so important for me to share. The church that I was attending, the pastor at the church I was attending, is the person who taught me about generosity, because he kindly but firmly insisted that tithing, giving 10% away, was what was best for me, best in terms of my spiritual growth, and also was expected. And so I had the privilege, and I put it this way now, when I started my working career, first job out of college, to base my budget on 90%. And I gave 10% away. And I can tell you, absolute honesty, I never missed what I didn't consider to be mine in the first place. All the decisions I made about where I lived, what car I drove, what clothes I bought, what food I ate, what vacation I went on, was based on the 90%. And I am so thankful for that. I can't tell you how thankful I am for that now. At the time I did it really as out of a sense of obligation, which wasn't great, but I'm glad now. So that was probably in about 1981. Back when, for me, going to McDonald's was a treat. Don't get that at all now, but, things change as you grow older. And I was giving $20 a week in 1981. Made about $200 a week. not the rest of the story. Oh, by the way, and I know some people don't appreciate the fact that I share this, I give credit to this couple, not only for starting me on that path, but I wouldn't be at more than 20% now in my giving if it wasn't for these people. So they shaped my life. Okay, so it's not the rest of the story. What's the rest of the story? Well, I was so grateful for this couple, for this family, and because I recognized how they showed me the grace of God. I saw how the grace of God was at work through them in my life. I was so grateful for them and for the grace of God that every once in a while I would put $25 or $50 in an envelope, and I would go to their house early in the morning. I worked at the newspaper then, and I had to be to work at 7 a.m. Oh, that's another thing that changes. I had to be to work at 7 a.m., so about 6:30 I'd sneak up to their door, and I'd put this envelope with money, in their door, anonymously. Now, my gift to the church, my tithe, I did out of obligation. I'm glad for it now, but that's what I did. This gift, which was sacrificial at that time in my life, these gifts were totally, completely out of a sense of gratitude, the grace of God. And I have to tell you that I understand from that example what the Macedonians experienced, because I just loved doing it. I had such a sense of overwhelming joy that I still remember it. It's one of the best memories that I have. And so I understand how it was that in the midst of ordeal, in the midst of extreme poverty, I wasn't in the midst of extreme poverty, but I couldn't go do whatever I wanted. In the midst of extreme poverty, how it's possible to experience overwhelming joy and overflowing generosity. And so this week, as those of you who are members prayerfully consider those estimate of giving cards that either have already arrived or will arrive in the mail, as you think about what your support, financial support of the congregation will be in the coming year, as you think about our desire to enhance our youth ministry, there's going to be lots of reasons behind your giving. And all of them are valid. Let me say that. But if the primary reason behind our giving is gratitude for the grace of God in our lives, and if we are empowered by that grace, then watch out. Because if that's the case, then we will experience overwhelming joy and overflowing generosity. Amen.